share what I can here. So I am Lauren Silverman, and I have worked for the past few years at Gimlet, which is a podcasting company that started way back in the early days of podcasting, 2014, and now is part of Spotify. So it is a much bigger organization. We are one of 4 sort of studios part of Spotify. So I have experience working with smaller shows and at NPR as a reporter and local stations, as well as now a much bigger behemoth with Swedish overlords, who are great. So all that to say, what I'm going to share with you guys today can be scaled for a team that is a very small team of just 2 people, or it can be for a much larger team of 6 people, or even a dozen if you happen to be that lucky. Whatever size show you're working on, some form of organization and strategy is always going to be necessary. So the first podcasts I worked on at Gimlet were serialized seasonal shows, meaning we would spend a bunch of time scoping out a story that we wanted to report on, months recording, investigating, and editing, and then eventually we would release 4 to 10 highly produced, deeply fact-checked episodes on that one subject or character or company. The most recent show that I worked on, Conviction Season 2, we shared the story, very tragic story of what happened to a boy named John Quinney in Texas, which is about the larger story of something called the Satanic Panic in the US. You may have heard of it. So I'm going to play a video trailer just to give you a feel for what a serialized show looks like that I've worked on at Gimlet. And hopefully you will be able to hear that. So here we go.
John was not lying when he got on that stand. He wasn't telling the truth, but he believed he was telling the truth. I was accused of being a satanic cult leader and of leading a satanic ritual sacrifice.
Lots of people believe this stuff. There were allegations all across the country.
The entire American mental health industry had lost its mind.
They were not only convicted of something that they did not do, but they were convicted for something that did not happen.
I've heard the word satanic panic. You know, like it wasn't real, but then I'm like, hey, it was real, I'm right here. Dude was in prison because of me.
All right, so that is the trailer for the season 2 of Conviction. And like I said, that was a serialized story that we spent a lot of time in production on. And I know most of you are probably not working on seasonal serialized stories. You're probably working on more ongoing shows, daily, weekly, monthly. It's a little bit easier, more sustainable financially to create something like that than it is to spend 6, 12 months investigating something and then putting out a product. So I'm going to focus today on ongoing shows. And that is the type of show that I'm working on now, is an ongoing show that just launched a few months ago at Gimlet. It is called How to Save a Planet. And the hosts are Gimlet co-founder Alex Bloomberg and marine biologist Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. So as many of you are creating your own shows, you're probably putting together promos, 30-second promos, minute-long promos. These are things that can live in other people's show feeds. I'm not going to go too much into that, but I want to play for you a 30-second promo, both so you can get a feel for the show that I'm going to be talking about organization on today, and maybe let you hear what one promo from us sounds like.
So what happens on this podcast, Alex?
The podcast is going to answer the following question. What do we need to do to address the climate crisis? And how do we make those things happen? We're going to be answering that question on this podcast every week from now until...
Until?
The job is done,
Until
Ayana.
the job is done.
I'm trapped and I want a better prenup.
From Gimlet, How to Save a Planet is out now.
With me, Alex Bloomberg.
And me, Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson.
Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
So you heard in that promo there, Ayana, she said, we're doing this podcast until the job is done. And since I'm not that much of an optimist on climate change, I think that's going to take a while. So we better make this show sustainable. And that is precisely what I am here to talk to you about today, is how do you make a show like this sustainable, that is every single week? Because when I first heard that it was going to be a weekly show, I thought, how the hell are we going to make this without burning out? And the reason I was so concerned about burnout is I think it is one of the major factors for why shows do not succeed. We often hear about how many podcasts there are. There are a lot of podcasts out there in the universe. There are more than 1.5 million. What we don't hear about is how many of them come crashing down. A lot of reasons for this: money, time, host incompatibility, slow audience growth, etc. But let's say that you have a good product, a good podcast, and let's say you're growing your audience and you are getting some source of funding. The most important thing that you can do, the thing that's going to make it possible to keep going, is planning strategically and organizing your show. So the first part of organization for me and for this show, How to Save a Planet, is something that I'm calling building your core. This is the place where everything in your podcast, calendar, budget, tracking, pitches will live. So that's the first thing we're going to talk about. It's going to give it staying power, give your podcast staying power. And then we're going to talk about format variety and how to use different types of episodes that have varying levels of difficulty and time involved to break up the cadence and also give yourself a break so you are not constantly going at 110. And then lastly, we're going to talk about how you combine those two things. You think about format variety, episode variety to schedule strategically. So let's start with the first one, which is building your core, tracking ideas and progress. And your core is essentially like your mission control. So let's take a look at what a core looks like. For me, it is in Google Sheets. There are a lot of softwares that offer you sort of cores, things like Asana or other ones, but they can be expensive, and you can really create your own style core if you just do it in something like a Google Sheets. Sorry, hold on, let me go back a minute. I am going to actually share an example going inside the core of How to Save a Planet. Now we're going to switch over to a different tab here, and I will maximize that. Hopefully you all can see what this looks like. And this is the core for How to Save a Planet, with some confidential details slimmed down and taken out. But basically what the core is this mission control. It's your home base. And because you're basically commanding a mission to Mars. It's just that stressful. A little lower stakes, but it's just that stressful. And the first tab that I want to focus on is the publish schedule. So this is a big picture. This is how many episodes are you creating in a year? And when are those episodes going to be coming out? And this is important not just for yourself, so you know, and on your team, what are we making and how often and what the cadence is, but so that you're planning in breaks and having time off, whether that's around holidays or otherwise, and so that you can figure out how much product, how many shows and ads you can, and if you're doing it for with ad breaks, how many ads you have available as inventory to sell. So it is really about planning to be consistent. We know that consistency is really important for ongoing shows in terms of retaining audience and growing your audience. So this is like the big picture. How many episodes do you want to make in a year? What days are you going to take off, etc. So that is the first tab in this core that I wanted to show. And then the second tab, after you know how many episodes you're going to create, you need to figure out what you're going to fill them with. What is episode 13? What is episode 20? What is episode 40 going to be? And so that's when we're going to look at our pitches tab. Now, if you don't already have some sort of regular pitch meeting going with you or you and your however many people are on your team, it's really important to fit that in and to find a time to talk through ideas and what you want to do in episode 2, 3, 4, 24, 34, whatever. We keep track of all of our pitches in this tab, and you can see the key columns are what is the pitch? What's the description of the pitch? Who is the person suggesting the idea? Who are we suggesting talking with? And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but the lift is about how heavy or how hard is this going to be to create? Because each episode will require a different amount of reporting and research and guest tracking, etc. So we use this to keep track of all the episodes, all the ideas, whether or not they end up becoming episodes, so that you can look back and see what you've already talked about or why you decided not to do something. On the side here, I have a column that you can, say we are going to go forward with this pitch. Let's see about, let's choose one that makes a lot of sense here, about nuclear power or whatever. If we are going to go forward with that, I will then click the in production box, or if we're going to pass on it, hold on, I will click this and it'll get crossed out. Or if we're going to hold it, it'll turn a different color. This is just for organization. You do not need to do this, but it's a way that I like to have a quick picture of what are we moving forward with, what are we passing on, and not just keep it in a Google Doc. So that is the pitches document. And hopefully you're asking now, okay, I have a whole bunch of episodes for the year. I have a whole bunch of ideas. What happens when I say I want to go forward with something? And that is when this episode tracker is born. This is like the next level of detail for slotting in those pitches and those ideas into your schedule. You can see in our episode tracker, we're literally just keeping track of what episodes are going when and where they are in the production process. So it includes the obvious, the date of publish, the episode description, and this description is also something that we use on iTunes or in Spotify. So it is the show notes, what the description of the episode is going to be. We keep track of the theme for that show. So if we're doing a show that is on culture or politics, we want to know so that we can provide some variation for the listeners and make sure that we're touching on all of the different themes and topics that as a show we've set out to cover and include. We keep track, of course, of who's responsible for this thing, who is bringing it forward, who can I go to say, hey, where is this episode at? What do we need to do next? That is the lead producer here. These are guests, so the people who you're actually going to hear on that episode. So are these the interviews that are planned? Status, we have just a note of, so we can all glance quickly, whether it's marketing people, whether it's other folks at different parts of Spotify, whether it's me trying to remember where something is at. We have the format. We have a note about fact checking and legal, if that is going to be an issue for an episode. And if you're lucky enough to have any outside help with fact checking, who's going to be doing that? And then we have a column here that's about how heavy a lift. Again, we'll talk about this in a minute, how much production is going into this episode. And then we have a tracker for diversity that is tracking like who we have on the show. And that's something that we can look back at however frequently we have it slotted in, whether that's quarterly or whatever. So you can keep track of who you have on your show and how you're doing in terms of getting a variety of guests on the show. So you can see just real quickly, we had this last week on our show, How to Save a Planet. We aired something called from the podcast Drilled on it. And so that is, this actually should be filled in. I'll go take a second to do that right now. A lighter lift there. So we are only up to episode number 10 so far. So if you have a new podcast, I can relate to you right now. All right, let's talk a little bit about that format variety where you see something that says format interview, format swap, format tell. What does that mean? And I'm going to go back now to this other presentation. And we've talked a little bit about this core document where you track ideas and episode status. And as you bring those episodes to life, you're going to want to think about what shape are they going to take. So there aren't that many categories or formats for a show. There's chat shows, there's narrative stories or reported pieces. There are interviews, roundtables, and combinations of all of those. But there are 5 formats that I find really useful for ongoing programming that you can use for your show. And they bring something fresh to your audience. They help you network and make connections, and they take different amounts of work, which means you can plan ahead for heavier and lighter weeks strategically. So the first one is the tell. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the interview. We'll talk about field reported piece, collaborations, and episode swaps. So the first one is an interview format. And that is something that I'm guessing most of you are pretty familiar with. It's straightforward, but it's also really hard to pull off an interview well. You've got to have a really dynamic guest who can go through a range of emotions and be honest and open and have sort of a lively personality that comes through. So they're hard to get unless you have a great guest, but they're the easiest in terms of actual production because you're just having 1-2 voices on the show. So I'm going to share an edited version of an interview that the hosts of How to Save a Planet, Alex and Ayana, did with someone named Rihanna Gunwright. She's a climate policy leader. And I think this might be just to remind you what a strong interview sample show format sounds like.
What would you say to people who are thinking of sitting this election out because they're not excited enough about the climate plan that Biden has put forward?
I get it. Like, I get not wanting to vote, and I get why you would not want to continue to vote for a party that often says one thing and does another, right? But I guess the thing, and I was on a talk, and an activist called Vic Barrett said this, and it really struck me. He was like, vote is an act of community, right? In a time where, especially we're talking about climate change is a communal challenge, it's something that's facing us all, well then vote like it's facing us all. And for me, I'm just like, I have one goal, which is I'm not trying to do this shit in 50 years. I'm not trying to be an activist. I'm trying to sit down, bake some cakes, look at some nature, and mind my damn business.
Goals.
That is my goal. And so like, and for that
we gotta
to
wrap
happen,
this up, people. We gave you squab.
We fixed this whole climate crisis thing so we could just like get back to our pastries.
I have things to do. And so like, that is my goal.
All right, that's an example of just a sort of lively, emotional, and also, from the seriousness to the joy and laughter that is an example of what you're looking for in a good interview. So that is format number 1. Format number 2, I'm calling the tell. There are a lot of names for this, none of which are very good. Some people call it talk back or a dump, which really sounds awful. Basically what a tell is when a reporter or a producer or one of the hosts goes off and reports on something and then writes a script and comes back and shares it with the host. And they record themselves telling the story and then edit that tell down to an actual episode, sometimes adding in some more writing or editing, but it's basically telling a story. So let's hear an example of what a tell sounds like. And this is the first time we're bringing on one of the reporters from our show to talk with the hosts of the show to share some science.
Welcome back. So before the break, we were talking about Mr. Beast and his giant tree planting stunt. And we promised you some science.
To talk about the science of trees, we brought in our most encyclopedic team member, science journalist, and previously climate reporter with the New York Times, Kendra Pierre-Louis.
And I'm particularly excited to welcome Kendra on the show because it will help me realize this secret dream that I've had for a while now about this podcast. Ayana, you know those morning zoo style radio shows? You know what I'm talking about? Where they have like Wacky Steve and they have the sound effects, and it's just sort of like it's this big group of people like during your drive time radio, and they prank call people and they play songs. Secretly in the back of my mind, I was like, can we bring some of that energy to this podcast?
Welcome to the Climate Morning Zoo.
Exactly. So, Kendra Pierre Lewis, welcome to the Climate Morning Zoo / How to Save the Planet. Wah, wah, wah.
Hi.
Wait, if this is a morning zoo, what animal am I?
Oh, obviously a bear.
Yeah.
I
clearly.
don't think that's the way morning zoo radio shows work.
Wait, can I be a giraffe?
I don't think everybody is assigned an animal.
Can I please be a giraffe? Please.
Yes, okay, fine. You can be a giraffe. Okay, so Kendra, we have just one question for you. How powerful is planting trees as a climate solution?
So in terms of trees and their connection to climate, in many ways, they are climate change dynamos. The thing that you guys really want to know about is whether or not they absorb carbon dioxide.
So Kendra goes on to share science and what she knows about and has gone to research about how effective trees are as a climate solution, whether we can plant trees and plant our way out of the climate crisis. But what that's showing is how you can vary up the format by bringing someone on who may often be behind the scenes. And it's a lighter lift for the hosts or host, and it is a bit heavier for the person who's going off to do the reporting. So next we're going to talk about third format, which is a field reported piece. This is something that you've heard in many forms, whether you're listening to someone who's reporting in another country or who's reporting on some small farm and you hear cows and geese, and that is what this example is. I'm going to skip it for time, but basically it is a heavy lift because you are sending someone out into the field to get tape. You are scheduling ahead of time. You are possibly travel is involved, possibly permissions from the people you're interviewing. So it requires a lot of work, but it can pay off in terms of the sounds and the things that you bring back in audio form. The next format we're going to talk about is collaborations. Especially if you are a small podcast trying to grow your audience, collaborations are key to making that happen and driving new listeners to your show. There also can be very heavy lifts, so you should try and do a few of these a year if you can, depending on the team size that you have. For us, it made sense to start our first collaboration with NPR's Planet Money. They have a large audience, and we already were reporting a story we knew that their audience would like. So we went to them and said, hey, we've got a story that your audience is going to like. We might not have as big an audience as you do, but this is going to be a great collaboration. And how can we make this happen? Went through a few rounds. They liked the story. And we ended up creating a piece that you can listen to. It's on Spotify called Cold Hard Cash for Your Greenhouse Gas. Here is a little bit of what it sounds like when it aired on Planet Money. Oops, let me go back for a second.
This is Planet Money from NPR.
When we think about the things that are causing global warming, that are heating up the planet, right? We usually think about things like carbon dioxide coming out of factory smokestacks or car exhaust.
But there's this other greenhouse gas out there that's even more dangerous. It's lurking in garages and sheds all over the country. It's a kind of invisible threat that most people don't even think about. Except these guys.
So I'm Tim Brown, and I'm driving in Illinois with my partner, Gabe Plotkin.
Tim and Gabe are driving an SUV through downstate Illinois. Flat, straight roads, nothing but corn and soybeans as far as you can see. And they're on a mission.
Hold on just a minute. I got to give Gabe the address. It's 903 North.
They're on a mission to track down some of this invisible threat.
All
We're
right.
going to go collect and destroy greenhouse gases. That's very exciting.
And they're letting us tag along by video.
Look at this. We're on a field trip together.
Tim and Gabe pull into a gas station at one of those rural intersections, you know, the kind where it's two perpendicular roads meeting in the middle of acres and acres of corn. And waiting for them there in the parking lot, in a red Jeep Renegade, is the guy they came to meet.
And there he is. Why don't you just go down the street for a minute, Gabe? There he is right there.
All right, I'll leave you with a cliffhanger so you can go check it out. But the point of that is it's a reported piece that has been reported with another show, another podcast with a larger audience. Then the last format I'm going to talk about is something that is sort of like a collaboration, but slightly easier. It can still bring you new listeners and new friends. It's an episode swap. Unless you are superhuman, you're going to need to take a break. And that can actually be a chance to build connections with other podcasters and even promote your show elsewhere to new audiences. So this is what I was mentioning we did last week on How to Save a Planet. We needed a bit of a break. So we aired an episode of a podcast that we think our listeners would really like from the podcast Drilled. And Drilled will air one of our episodes of How to Save a Planet in their feed next month. So we swapped episodes, and there are formal and informal ways to do this, but it is important when you do it to warn your listeners. So to create a special intro that tells them what's going to be happening on that episode, so that they don't just hear random people in their feed. It's like an intimate space to be. You're in your bedroom and you hear a stranger's voice. It's a little bit creepy. So happy to talk about the details of what a trade like that might look like if people have questions as well. All right. So you've seen 5 episode styles or formats. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just 5 that we are using pretty frequently on our ongoing show. And each one has a different level of work involved for the hosts and the producers, if you are on a team with producers. The lightest is definitely the interview in terms of planning. You've got to do prep for the interview and you've got to get the person and get them in, but you don't have to do a ton of reporting or get lots of voices. The heaviest is probably the collaboration and the field reported piece, where you're really going out and getting tape and working with new people. That's going to take the most time. So that's important to keep in mind when you're creating your episode list for your season or for your month or for your year. So now you can see how this is, again, the screen from the Google Sheets tab, where I'm just highlighting format. We are outlining that we're getting a variety for different episodes. And this is factored into like how much time it's going to take to create this episode. If it's a tell, the hosts are going to be less time on their part. They're just going to have to be active listeners and say funny things. Whereas if it's interviews, it's going to require more time from the hosts, same with a field reported piece. All right, so we've gone through the core using format variety. And in terms of scheduling your show and using this info, this is just an example production calendar where you can see people might need, I plan how many weeks someone is going to need to work on a particular episode. So if it's a certain format, we might say, okay, 2 weeks on this, or 3 weeks on this, or 1 week on this. So you can use these sheets, this idea as a template to plan out who's going to be working on what when, and work backwards from when you want to publish something. We even have a very detailed breakdown of big meetings and deadlines for How to Save a Planet. So when you're thinking about your show, you might want to think, how many edits do I want for my episode? Do I just want 1 edit? Do I want no edit? Do I want 4? And you're going to have to work in your week, if you're a weekly show. Where are you going to fit that in? Where are you going to fit in time for retracts or corrections if in fact checking you uncover if something is wrong? Where are you going to have time reserved for interviews for shows that are interview based? So it's really helpful, especially for me, when you have people working on multiple time zones across the country and outside of the country, to have a somewhat similar schedule each week. Of course it changes, but this is a way to know with 2 very busy hosts when you're going to have time reserved. So that is, of course, we use Google Calendars, we use calendars as well, but this is sort of a summary of when we generally do what on our show. All right, the last thing that I'm going to say before questions is less a tip about organization than it is about sanity. Working on a show about climate change is pretty depressing sometimes. It's fun, but it's pretty depressing. And the thing that we try and do differently on our show is really about embedding laughter whenever possible into it. Think about your show. You want to think about what your secret ingredient is. What can you fall back on when things are just not going that well? Maybe it is humor, maybe it is your ability to get amazing guests, maybe it's something else, but lean on that. For us, again, it is humor. So I will play you one clip before we get to questions to just give you an example of how we don't shy away from that. We don't cut that out of our interviews and of our shows. And this is an interview. The first voice you're going to hear is with Colette Pichon Battle, who's a climate activist.
I grew up in a community called Bayou Vincent. Where I live is on my grandfather's property. It's a house that my grandfather built with his own hands in Bayou Liberty. All behind it is just trees. We have big, tall yellow pines, oaks, magnolias. There's a big ditch. I know it sounds horrible, but we got a lot of water. And so the big ditch was where you could always find something swimming around, a frog, a turtle, sometimes a baby alligator. And we didn't wear shoes a lot. We picked up stuff that was crawling a lot.
So you had this ecological grounding from where you grew up, but thinking about like the climate wasn't something that was necessarily on your mind, or climate change?
Nope. Climate change, nope, not on my mind. Climate, not on my mind. And I remember being called a environmentalist like in 2006. And I was like, well, I'm not an environmentalist. That was like a dirty word down here, by the way. Like, I was like, I'm not an environmentalist. I'm a bayou girl, And they're like, well, you want us to do something about the trees. And I'm like, everybody around here wants you to do something about the trees. We're not environmentalists. We just love trees. It's.
I'm just a tree hugger, but only in the literal
I'm just a tree
sense.
hugger.
I have never metaphorically
I don't know what you're talking about.
hugged a tree. Only in actuality.
I'm gonna
What about me
only
hugging
in actuality.
trees? Makes you think I'm an environmentalist.
It's true. It's true.
What did it mean to the people that you grew up with, and to you maybe at that time? I don't know.
I mean, as a Black person, environmentalist meant white person. And they are people who don't actually like nature. They just like looking at it, right? They like it to be preserved, but they don't know anything about it.
The truth of this is just brutal. Anyway, keep going.
How does it feel, Alex, to have someone read your soul through the phone?
We are all who we are, but I'm just saying, like, that's what that meant.
All right, so that is just a clip with a little bit of humor. And now let's turn to questions. I know you guys have a lot of questions, and I went through a ton of organization and didn't go through all of those tabs, but I'm happy to try and answer questions now.
Yay. Thank you so much, Lauren.
Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you. Beautiful slides, and thank you for delving into with examples from actual spreadsheets. So I'm just going to try to look through some of the questions. Thank you, everyone, for asking questions. Again, we might not be able to get through everyone, but hopefully we'll make some progress. So let me see if I can find. There were a lot of questions about whether the slides are being recorded. This whole session is being recorded, so you'll be able to see the presentation in our recording, and we'll be posting it onto our website. So that's for your reference in the future. And then so this question is for you, Lauren. About templates. I think a lot of people were inspired by the way you organize things. Is there a template you recommend, or if not, how would you go about how would you recommend going about it?
Yeah, so I mean, I built these based off of experience in terms of what I needed for my show. I would suggest maybe looking back at these for ideas, but it probably won't fit what you need for your show. But if you can look at the columns and think, okay, that helps me, that doesn't help me, that helps me, that doesn't help me, I would suggest making it yourself. I found that when I've used templates that are available for anything online, I end up discarding them because it's sort of one of those things where if you build it, it fits you and you'll use it. Whereas if you just download something, it's like a piece of clothing that is completely for the wrong person.
Cool. So again, this presentation will be made available, and you can go back, look through at the different ways that the slides are, the sheets are organized, and then adapted for the needs of your team. Great, cool. So the next question is, this is from Andy Wang, what does producer/host interview prep of a guest really look like?
Yeah, good question. So depends how big your team is. If you are really small and you just have one or two people, then interview prep is really about doing research about the person you're going to interview and thinking about how you want that interview to go, what topics you want to hit, and what kinds of questions are going to get you to those topics. So it's a lot of planning about what's the point of this interview, what's the big picture message that you're trying to get across, and how are you going to tell that in a way that that resonates and is interesting and has some turns or surprises throughout the interview. So it's about coming up with doing a lot of reading about the person, or a pre-interview, which is always helpful, to ask them a few key points that you know you're going to want to talk about, and then mapping that out in a doc and going over it and having that ready before your interview.
Cool, thank you. This question is from Eric Yanez. Sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly. So how big is the time window between producing the show and the actual launch to the public? So what would you take into consideration for the launch schedule versus producing schedule? So that's like one part of the question. And then for stories that are reported during an extended period of time, any recommendations on how to track its progress?
Yes, I'm just glancing at it to make sure I got that clearly. Yeah. So the producing the show and the actual launch to the public, do you mean production and then when the episode airs, or do you mean before you launch the show?
I think it's like, it seems like it's launch time versus like the prep to edit the...
To make a brand new show to the world, or like how many weeks before an episode?
Good question.
Not sure. Well, I'll mention both. I mean, we spent many months getting ready to launch this show to the world. So, I mean, anywhere from 6 months is sort of an average time that it might take to get a whole show ready. And if it's ongoing, if it's an investigative series, that can be longer. It can really depend. But for an ongoing show, you want to try and bank a few episodes so that you aren't launching right out the gate and you have nothing for any of the next weeks. So that is a little bit more at launch. In terms of production before we air our episodes on Thursdays, for example. And so we are working a few weeks in advance where we're working on edits and interviews for a few weeks ahead, at least, while we're working on the current show that is going to be aired, for example, this week. And then extended period of time, how to track its progress. Yeah, I mean, that's where the sort of like episode tracker and constant check-ins come in, where you're seeing where things are at and whether they're sort of on hold or it's moving along. But I think if you have people on your team, you should be having hopefully regular check-ins to see like where are their stumbling blocks, how can you help each other out, what's causing things to be slowed down.
Thank you, Lauren. Next question. What tools have you found helpful for keeping your team connected and organized with remote working? So.
Oh, yes. I mean, really, I think that this whole like organizer that I shared with you has been more helpful than it has in past shows, given that we're remote. I've always used something like this, but now I think people are actually in it a lot more because we can't just say hi to each other in the same way. But we just use Slack and lots of meetings. And that is so far the only way we've stayed connected. We are planning a sort of virtual offsite, but that is TBD.
Thank you. This question is from Ashley Hobbs. When you're planning how much time you'll need for edits, fact checking, etc., have you found that certain amounts of time work best for various formats? So like example, interviews typically need one round of edits, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, great question. Yes, definitely. If every one of our episodes generally has several edits, so a few edits, and those edits can be in different formats as well. So we might have an edit that is called a table read, where someone will actually go through their script and share their sound in a sort of draft form so people can hear what it might sound like. That is like a first edit. And then as it goes forward, a second edit, a third edit might be in the script where people are leaving comments on the actual wording or what to cut or what to add. So it becomes a little bit more fine-tuned as you go on. But generally speaking, yeah, field pieces and collaborations are going to require more edits. So you're going to want to work that in than something that's just a two-way conversation. And the same for fact checking. So if I know we're going to have a really complicated piece that's going to require a lot of fact checking, and I saw someone asked about fact checking also in there. If you're lucky enough to have the budget to hire an external fact checker for a few hours or however many hours, that's helpful. If not, you're going to want someone on your team or yourself to allocate time for fact checking if you're doing field reporting and you're not sure. Well, we do fact checking for all our episodes, but especially if it's a complicated one where you're going to need to retrieve old documents, or you're going to need to do more than like simple Google searches to find out to verify some of the information that your guest has said.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So this next question is similar to the previous one about communicating. What communication methods do you use to track things like edits, mix notes, script notes, etc.? What has been effective to make sure producers and engineers are working together effectively? So
yeah.
Slack, but is there any other recommendations?
Yeah. Actually, I will say that we've come up with a way to say, okay, we're going to share drafts of a mix. An engineer is going to share a draft of a mix on Tuesday nights and Wednesday nights so that people can listen Wednesday morning and Thursday morning or whatever it is that you have worked in. And we say, okay, X day is only for notes about the sound of this episode for the engineer, or only for the mix. The first one, that is notes about editorial content and wanting to change wording or different things. So you're going to want to probably establish something with your team about what level notes are we giving at which point. So in the first edit, we're going to give notes about structure, and we're not going to give notes about whether the music cue sounds great. We're going to wait on that. Or, I mean, you can decide what works best for you, but deciding what level notes is a great way to go about it so that everyone's on the same page and isn't throwing in all their notes about every single thing at once. And we also use in comments, we all the time at each other, flag each other, tag each other, however you want to say it, to know who is supposed to be responding to which comment. So every time I leave a comment that is for an engineer, for our engineer, who is Emma, and she's great, we leave notes. We say, hey, Emma, this is a note for you. Can you fix this audio? It still sounds weird, or whatever. Or, hey, at Caitlin, who's our editor, can you look at this new structure? What do you think? So we're constantly tagging each other in the comments in the docs.
Nice, thank you. And on this question of how to do stuff remotely and other resources, we on our website have a podcaster toolbox that you can take a look at there. There are resources there as well. Okay, so next question from Connor Sweetman. What are some common mistakes or misuses of time from your less experienced? So yeah, common mistakes from less experienced teams.
Good question. I think one common mistake is like walking out of meetings or away from edits without establishing what the next steps are and who's responsible for them. So you can have a great meeting and you can talk a lot about how something needs to change, or you really should do an episode on this or whatever. If you're not actually writing down like, oh, okay, who's going to do that and who needs to do what by when after the great ideas, those things can all just sort of fall away. So I think it's an easy mistake to make, and definitely one that I made earlier on, where I would leave meetings and be like, oh, wait, who's going to actually do all those things we talked about? So it's really helpful at the end of your meeting to dedicate 5-10 minutes to, when you're talking about whether it's an edit or pitches or scheduling or whatever. Okay, so what did we all agree on here, and who's going to do what? That's one piece of advice.
Cool. And a related follow-up question is, I guess for smaller teams, do you build marketing / PR efforts into your process?
Yes. So marketing and PR, now that we're part of Spotify, I'm lucky enough that there's actually people who have studied how to do this type of thing. And it is not us just guessing quite as much, it's them guessing. But yes, we communicate with marketing and PR in our weekly check-ins, so they are up to date on what we're working on, and we'll be thinking about ideas for how they might be able to peg that to a news event, or where they might be able to pitch that idea. So we communicate with them. And the most important thing is they can see all those tabs that I shared with you. So they know what do we have on schedule for when. And that's really helpful. If it is a smaller team and it's really just you doing marketing and PR, then I would definitely build that in. I didn't talk about like our newsletter, but we have deadlines built in for a first draft of a newsletter, final newsletter going out. You guys should sign up as well to the How to Save a Planet newsletter if you're interested. So yeah, you're going to want to build that in. You're going to also maybe want to find once a month a day where you're just like doing outreach and keeping track. I have a tab for contacts for PR and possible people you want to do collaborations with. So definitely want to build that in.
Thanks. Cool. Here's another question. Someone once told me it takes about 20 hours to produce a single podcast episode. Exclamation. Is that true? Sad. Smiley face.
Oh
sad.
Man. 20 hours. I mean, this is a hard one. I don't know that I can answer how many hours exactly an episode takes, but I would say definitely 20 hours sounds like a good amount for certain podcasts. It just depends on the episode and what type it is. But it's easy to underestimate, I think, is the bigger point, how many hours it takes to do a highly edited episode. Then again, if you're doing a show that's a format that's really just a chat show, it might take much less.
Thank you. Cool. So here's a question from Benson. Is it okay to use different formats for different episodes in the same show? Or I guess what's the benefit of it? Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, I know a lot of people think like, oh, we have to always do it the same way. It can get really boring if you always do it the same way, is my feeling, both for you and for your listeners. That doesn't mean that you should mix it every single week, but it's nice to have a few different sort of, we used to call them like pieces of furniture or things you can swap in that are like, oh, today we're going to do listener mail and it's going to be a listener mail episode. Or, oh, today we are going to do a tell and one of the reporters is going to come on. I think it's nice if you can introduce your listeners that you're going to do that and tell them, say, oh yeah, sometimes on the show, we're going to do this style of show. And today, this is happening. Don't be shy about talking to your listeners. They're just, people like us, and maybe, giving them a little bit of a heads up is nice. But I would just say, come up with a few different formats that you want to use. Don't just rely on the same exact format every single episode.
Thanks. And a follow-up, I think from some of the questions, it seems like the concern is that people are like, oh, we should be consistent. So I guess my follow-up would be, what do we need to keep consistent to make sure to engage the audience, if not the format?
Totally. Yeah. And I would say also, like, doing mostly one format is fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with that for consistency's sake. But consistency's sake is more about the host and the demeanor of the show and the style than it is, I think, about what format that comes in. We keep consistent our episode intro. So we have a few lines we always say at the top, and we have our theme music that's always the same. That's probably enough to get you through. Yeah.
Thank you. That's helpful. A question from Ali. Could you talk more about editing and where light, medium, and heavy editing would be appropriate?
Yeah. So I think that in terms of editing, and if you're lucky enough to have an editor who's a dedicated editor, then it's important to figure out with them when they're available as you're working on an episode, so you can plan several edits. The episodes that are going to require the most editing are the ones that are field reported pieces where you're using tape from outside and you're writing transitions or bridges. I saw some of you ask about what a bridge is. Bridge is just like transitions between tape or an interview and speaking to your audience outside of that interview, coming out of it and resetting the stage. So the more of those bridges, transitions, and descriptions and writing mixed in with tape that you have, the more you're probably going to want an editor to think about the structure with you and what you're saying. Whereas if you're just doing an interview that's a two-way conversation, you might need a big edit up front to help you figure out what pieces stay and go in what order. But as you get more detailed, you'll probably want more farther along in the episode, you probably won't need as much editing.
Cool. Thank you, Lauren. This is a question we commonly get. We get a lot of similar questions here. Any insights as far as how to successfully collaborate and pitch your show to a team with a more popular podcast?
Yes, this is a great question. And it is intimidating to go and ask a show with a bigger audience to collaborate, and you're going to have to be willing to be turned down. That's the first thing I will say is like, everyone gets turned down and you won't get anywhere if you don't try. So it's always worth trying. And the thing that you have to sell is not your audience. It's not the number of listeners you have, but you do have other things. You have possibly time. And even more importantly, hopefully you have a good story, or at least an idea, and an idea for who you'd speak with for a story that speaks to their audience. Remember, I showed you that publish schedule that shows weeks off and holidays. Bigger podcasts want to take time off, and they also want to do things that are different formats and bring new voices to their listeners. So if you can hit one of those points and tell them that you have that, then there's a chance that they might be interested.
Cool, thank you. I'm going to try to see if there's another good one here that we should. There's a lot of good questions. Just want to make sure I cover.
Yeah, you guys have great questions. I'm just glancing through also.
Cool. So here, several people asked, what if I'm a one-person team, solo podcasting? What would you recommend in terms of the organizing for that?
Well, if you're doing this solo, it's so hard. So first of all, give yourself a big pat on the back, because it's exhausting, and I'm sure you're probably working another job at the same time. So I think that number one, if you're doing it alone and you just want to be doing alone, it's one thing. But if you have any interest in working with someone else, I would suggest working with someone else, both because it's so much work, and because having someone to bounce ideas off of and having someone to be a sort of audience for your ideas and to share their perspective is really nice. So if you're open to the idea of collaboration, I don't know if you guys have tools for connecting people, but that's I think that's a really important thing to consider. And if you aren't, and you just want to make this thing yourself, I still would say organizing and using some of the templates that I showed in terms of how many episodes you're going to make, what your own personal schedule is going to look like, can come in handy. Make sure you do consider that you're going to be exhausted. And so realistically, your expectations as a solo podcaster who also has a 9-to-5 job, you've got to be somewhat kind to yourself. And that is why I definitely suggest trying to find some other folks who you might be able to hook up with.
Thank you. There's a question about wondering if you can clarify the format of the tell.
So the tell format is really about, you need 2 people for it to work. That can be any arrangement of 2 people. And it could be 2 hosts, it could be a producer and a host, whatever. But it is just about going out into the field and looking for the answer to a question. So the question could be anything from, can planting trees solve climate change, to, why do zebras have stripes? And a person goes out and does reporting and maybe interviews some people on that, some scientists or someone else. And then they get the tape from those interviews and they share that for the first time. They don't tell the answer to the other person until they're in the studio or on Zoom, whatever, recording. And they essentially walk the host through their process to finding the answer and the different turns that there might be and surprises in that story. So it's really telling a story to someone else for the first time, just like the audience will hear it.
Thank you. I think we have less than 1 minute left, so I'm going to wrap up with this one question that I think is very topical. It's, do you have any advice for how to recover if you've already burnt out?
Oh, man. I feel you. If you've already burnt out, I mean, this is a hard one. If you're relying on your podcast as a source of income, then it's really hard. But honestly, I would say try and walk away for a while. That is the only thing for me that has ever worked, which is leaving a project that hasn't worked or that has been too exhausting behind and taking a fresh breath, doing some rest and recovery, and then coming back either with a different idea or if you feel so inspired to the same thing. But sometimes taking a break is really necessary.